Welcome to the 63rd episode of the Interview Series. The Interview Series is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. And please like and subscribe to help us continue producing valuable content. I'm Matthew Schmidt, joined today by Jess Bowers. Jess Bowers lives in St. Louis, Missouri, where she works as an associate professor of English at Maryville University. Her debut fiction collection, Horse Show, was published by Santa Fe Writers Project in 2024. Her short fiction has also appeared in the Portland Review, Cream City Review, Redivider, Story Quarterly, the Indiana Review, Zone 3, Oyez Review, and other journals. She's also a co-editor at Cartridge Lit, an online journal publishing literature about video games. Welcome, Jess.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here. And I'm excited to talk about my stuff and how everything you just described fits together.
Awesome. So today we're going to be looking at One Trick Pony, which comes from Horse Show. Here's the cover here. And so I just wanted to start with the obvious. A lot of these stories are about horses or contain horses. So can you talk about your background in horses?
Yeah. Well, my family is not horsey at all, which is kind of unusual. Basically, as a really young kid, I fixated on horses sort of via My Little Pony and the Kentucky Derby. And I was just fascinated by this idea of a pet that you could ride. So I had like any toy that you can think of from the 80s that involved like, She-Ra, Swiftwind, all that. I was all in on all of it. And so my parents realized that this wasn't going away. And they got me riding lessons consistently when I was like 12, which is a very gangly age to learn how to ride. But I still had, kind of my childhood moxie, like I wasn't afraid. So yeah, and then ever since then, it was like I think my parents just always hoped it was a phase, and then it never was. And when I moved out to Missouri for my PhD, I started working at a therapeutic riding center, Cedar Creek Therapeutic Riding in Columbia, Missouri, which is an awesome facility that teaches people with disabilities how to ride. And while there, I met my first horse that I had owned, Billy, when I was like 27. And, grad school is not the best financial time to acquire a horse.
Right.
But emotionally, it was a really good idea. And hanging out with him really and spending time with him while I was running fiction really led to the beginnings of what eventually became Horse Show, in terms of just thinking about horses and their place in America and their place in my life and their place in the lives of people, for thousands of years, really. So nowadays I have Billy passed away, unfortunately, at the ripe old age of 27. And now I have Teddy, who is 13, and he is a stinker. But he's taught me a lot as well. So I think I'll always have a horse in my life. It's part of why I don't have kids, so that I can indulge this, because it's not just a pet, it's a lifestyle, which I think a lot of non-horse people don't realize. But it's once the bug has bitten you, it's for life. So even if I have to switch to minis, I will.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk to me about the minis. Like I've talked to several people who have had like mini horses.
Oh yeah.
How does that come about? Like do you
Well,
know the history of that?
Yeah, so people became, it's with any domestic animal, if you think about it, we have a miniature version pretty much. And so people became fascinated by the idea of small horses. And there are dwarf horses which look totally different, and then there are miniature horses which have been bred. One breed is the Falabella. There's also sort of American miniature horse breeds, but they breed them down. Now, the thing about a mini horse, they can pull a cart, which is fun. And if you have like a little kid, you could put that you hate, you could put on the mini horse because they tend to, they're horses. They're in a tiny package, but they are horses going through, and they require the companionship of other horses. You can throw them in with full size horses, and they think they run the place. So they're interesting, but I just feel like, as I sort of back down from wanting to ride as I get older, maybe driving would be good.
Yeah.
So cart,
Yeah, yeah.
cart. But I'll have, God willing, I'll have Teddy for another 15, 20 years. So we'll see.
Excellent. Yeah. No, yeah, I love animals, and I can't imagine, the amount of time and energy and money that it takes to, have a horse. Because
Yeah.
you have to have a place for a horse, you have to feed the horse, you have to ride the horse, you have to take care of the horse, etc.
Mhm. Yeah. One thing is that, time and money are kind of interchangeable. So like my horse, he doesn't live at my house. He lives about 15 minutes from where I live at a boarding stable. And people feed him every day and check on him. He also spends basically 24 hours a day just out in the field with other horses being a horse,
Oh, nice.
which is horses, one thing that a trainer told me once is that horses don't mind if you don't ride them, really. So because they don't really. But yeah, it is you have to be committed to it. It's not something that you can just put aside and expect to go well the next time you interact with the horse.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're a lot. They're a lot.
All right, so let's segue into discussing a little bit about horse show. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how do you go about composing a story?
Mm.
Because you sent me some notes, some things that you've researched, some pictures that you found, etc. It's like, how
Mhm.
do you kind of get into a story?
Mhm. Um, well, I try to one thing that I really am conscious of is trying to know the difference between a story and an anecdote. So sometimes you'll hear something interesting from history, and there's just not really a story you can hang on it, because in some of the cases in my book, such as One Trick Pony, the story that we're talking about today, um, there is sort of a linear sequence of events that occurred, and so there's a pretty, reasonable narrative to be drawn out of that. In other cases, it's something weird that there's just a few kind of snippets about, like the mammoth horse in the first story in the collection. There was just like a handbill, basically, and I had to work backward from there, learning about the Egyptian hall where the event took place, and then kind of piece all of it together, to create the general vibe, right? And then think about like who might have been there and how might they have interacted and what might have gone on. It's interesting. People always ask me, what's the how do you find your way through the history to find a story? And I think it usually starts with characters, you know, like somebody will interest me, whether it's a horse or a person, some choice they've made will interest me. And in all the cases in the book, the history if I tell you something directly about the person, it's true. But obviously it's fiction. I don't T. Barnum was thinking, that kind of thing. So
Right.
it's kind of, it's an interesting, I call it historical fiction, but people always ask me, but I think the way I start to compose a story is I get, as you said, I get these sort of notes, these sort of scraps, right, of things, some of which ends up becoming found text, like the text of the handbill, right, in the Mammoth Horse Waits. And then some of it, yeah, like some of it is just kind of things that I'm cutting and pasting, and then things that I'm writing as well. Like that first, those first two sentences there from One Trick Pony, I am I'm writing there.
Right.
I have heard about this. This is a fact I've found, and I am writing it. But then the next paragraph, I think I'm doing some of the same, but also trying to work out, okay, who am I focusing on here? Who's important? Because I'm always interested in directors. One Trick Pony is about the film Jesse James, and it's a terrible movie, but it's the movie that led to the no animals were harmed in the making of this movie, basically the monitoring of animal action on Hollywood movie sets. So in that sense, it's cinematically important. And so the story is about that stunt and all of that. So I'm trying to work out here, just looking at this, like who's important here. And I'm interested in the director because someone made a choice here, okay? A choice that led to the death of a horse, that led to the footage being used twice in the
Yeah.
movie. It's just from a creative standpoint, interesting decisions were made here. Yeah, yeah, there is the horrible moment, and the horse does indeed die. I don't know what the horse's name is, but I named the horse Babe after another horse I knew, because she deserves something. I think,
Yeah.
and yeah, and it's just you can tell, like looking at these stills, you can tell what's wrong. And I have the stills in my notes because I'm really into luxuriously describing landscapes in film. you know, it's sort of an ekphrastic, or I can never pronounce that word.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an exercise in sort of treating film the way that you might treat a painting or a Grecian urn, and describing what you're seeing, and then and I'm always interested in the spatial relationships, like in this shot. I just think it's a stunning shot, but for all the wrong reasons.
Right.
Um, so
Yes. Uh, very much.
that's yeah.
Yeah. I love film a lot, and I always tell people I'm like 3 credits shy of a minor in film, which is like one of those weird facts about me, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but I've never seen Jesse James, the movie, but I have seen that still somewhere. Like that's the one thing I've ever seen about that movie.
Yep.
And, based on your description of Jesse James, I don't really feel like I need to go back and watch it. Um,
No. No, it's really bad, and it's bad both in terms of, narrative. It's bad in every way it could be bad, right?
yeah,
Also in terms of the cultural mythologizing that it's doing. Um, it's just so problematic, but yeah, you're right. I've seen the shot in several film textbooks, for sure, because it is historic in terms of regulating what you can do with animals in the name of cinematic entertainment. And I think that in a way that's so ironic because they were trying to entertain. They abused this animal in order to entertain, and yet that is the only thing that act is the only thing that's remembered about the film. So it sort of doubles down on what was the point, you
right,
know? Which is a question I think I ask throughout the collection. That's something I didn't realize until I was editing it. for Santa Fe Writers Project. I was like, oh, okay. I'm asking throughout this. I mean, I'm not surprised given my own personal values, but at the same time, I was interested in how each of the stories asked that question.
Well, yeah, and it's shocking that during the research, right, you found out that none of the reviews even mention the scene.
Yeah.
It's like, how you go and watch this thing
Yeah.
and that happens and you're like, nothing really happened.
Eh. Yeah. It's wild. And I was, that's another way I kind of think my way through these stories is, you know, I think the casual reader might think, oh, she's just retelling something everybody already knows. But I thought to myself, what did the reviews say? Did anyone have anything to say about this at the time? Right? Because the legal system moves slowly. Slower than Hollywood
Oh
anyway.
yeah.
Yeah, and so when I discovered that none of the ones I could find, because I hit the archives for a lot of these stories. I love to dig through obscure databases and newspapers.com and things like that and find just the most obscure things. And yeah, when I realized that, I thought, God, okay, so in a way, that story is sort of, I want to tell the story because I want the reader to think about all these things. But I also wanted to, kind of make it larger than the still for people in a way.
Yeah. And that kind
Hmm.
of leads to one question I have, which is like, why choose fiction over nonfiction? Or like, you know, I kind of hate the genre tags, but it's the world we live in.
Hmm.
Um,
It is. It is.
and so, like, thinking about it, uh, like, say, if I were to think about it from my perspective, say I was the one writing the story, I think I would have trouble figuring out how to fit the fiction with the nonfiction.
Mm,
So I'm curious as to like how you find a way to make it flow smoothly through the stories.
mm. Well, I'm glad it flows smoothly. um, I think it's just part of it is just the way my brain works. It's like I kind of tell the story to myself, and in telling the story to myself, I find these holes in my knowledge that I then research to fill, and then I find a way to weave that in as well. A lot of it too, I'm just fascinated by history in general. So, a story being set in the 30s, like One Trick Pony, I'm gonna dig for everything I can about what was going on in the country at that time and weave as much of that in as I can, right, for authenticity's sake. But I call my work fiction because I could literally sit and go through line by line and tell you, oh yeah, I made that up. Okay. Or this is something that people thought, but it didn't actually happen, but people thought it, so I put it in there because it was weird. Things like that. And then some things that are just, you know, uh, I try in my narrative voice, and I think this is something that, people who give the collection a chance realize is that I try in my narrative voice to kind of take this remove that allows me to comment on what's happening while I'm dramatizing it. I actually I see what I do as kind of formally similar to film in some ways. If you've ever watched like a good historical biopic or something like that,
Yeah.
it's like there's some suspension of disbelief that goes into reading my stuff, so it's fiction, as far
Yeah.
as I'm concerned. And I don't really constrain myself in terms of like I don't sit here stewing like, oh, did he really think that? Because most of the time the people I'm writing about are long, long, long gone, or anonymous, or some of the people in there aren't real at all. Like all of the characters in Midwest Utility Breakdown or Granddad Swam, I made everybody in those stories up. So, it's interesting, and people are always asking me, like, why does it sound like nonfiction? Or it sounds like nonfiction to me. And I'm like, yeah, but I mean, historical fiction exists. It's not, maybe it doesn't usually sound like mine, maybe. I mean, but but nonfiction to me, oh, I'd have to tell the truth the whole time.
I
You
know
know,
that is kind of a bummer, isn't
it is.
it?
It is. And I would feel like I couldn't get as like speculative in terms of, there are a lot of moments in my stories where I speculate about what a person or an animal was thinking. And you can't really, I think, ethically do that in nonfiction, or at least I can't. So then I'm not much of a memoirist either. So I'm like, okay, yeah, I really think of what I do as fiction. And some of the stories in there are whole cloth, but it's always flattering that people people think it's not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you make a good point, that perhaps this isn't like all. I can't say like all, but a lot of other historical fiction,
Mm,
because having read some, this is more exciting somehow than a lot of historical fiction, and I think it has to do with your interest in obscure things and oddities and so on and so forth, because usually it's kind of like, well, here's the thing, and like we're going to kind of walk through like this aspect of this event or what have you.
mhm,
And it doesn't really, because it's such a large undertaking, it doesn't necessarily kind of stray off the path from the main event, whereas
mhm,
this does. And I think that's what is unique about it in my
mm.
my sense.
Thanks. Yeah, that, I think I'd never thought about it that way, but it's a great way to put it. I'm gonna steal that for later on. But yeah, I think in fiction, because, you can sort of stray off the beaten path in the way that something like, say, Titanic couldn't, In fiction, you can kinda, you can digress a little bit, and I think, again, my narrative voice, or the narrative voice that I try to use, I try to do that. I'm really inspired by writers like John Haskell, who, kind of obscure, but Scribner published his first collection, I Am Not Jackson Pollock, and he does similar things with film that are really cool. And it's that sort of age old tale of, well, I read something and I realized I had permission,
Yeah.
you know?
Right.
So, yeah, yeah, but I get the genre question a lot. I actually had someone recently who was insisting that someone owned the copyright on these horses and that I needed to credit them somehow, and it was baffling. But
How
I
would that
think
even work? Yeah, I
I
don't.
don't know, but I think people sometimes, when fiction is sort of really carefully researched, they get confused. But I'm interested in that. I'm fascinated by that line. There's a documentary film festival in Columbia, Missouri, where I lived for many years, called the True False Film Festival,
Okay.
and it's primarily documentaries, but they'll throw in a few where it's like, is that real? And then it'll be revealed that no, it wasn't real. And I love that. It's sort of, I think it goes, my interest in sort of oddities and hucksters and charlatans and raconteurs and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always find it difficult, when you like everything's on streaming services now, but
Mm,
when you read the description of the thing, I'm always like, I mean, I don't know, like whatever,
right.
because it's trying to say something. I don't know. They're trying to like engage so many people that it misses the whole point of the thing. Um,
Mhm.
anyway, minor gripe aside. So let's actually get some words in the air here. I'm going to ask you to read an excerpt from the final draft,
Okay.
and I will bring it up for our viewers here.
Sweet. Okay. Well, I will not read the headers
Okay.
because Jesse James's getaway horse won't jump off of a cliff, no matter how fast ace stuntman Cliff Lyons gallops her, snorting, toward the yawning edge. For 4 hours now, the film crew has been working on this stunt, destined to be the equestrian centerpiece of Jesse James. They've tried whips and spurs, hollering and waving, even threw lit firecrackers at the little mare's hind legs, hoping to panic her over. Now they have her wearing movie blinkers, serene equine eyes painted on a headstall, invisible in an extreme long shot. Tricks just like these have taught us horses in the Wild West love to china shop through saloons, collapse over tripwires, and soar boldly off 50-foot cliffs under heavy gunfire. So utter was their devotion to the American cowboy. But ace stuntman Cliff Lyons is careless on his first approach. He doesn't gallop fast enough, giving his mount time to notice the land is missing. All 12 subsequent jumps have ended with the little mare skidding to a halt, crow hopping and shaking her mane at the abyss, a hard no. On the shore below, 20th Century Fox contract director Henry King's threadbare patience phrase. He's spent 6 months preparing to shoot 5 seconds, scouting the ideal ratio of sublime crag to rangy poplar, consulting depth charts. Anachronistically poured in 1931, decades after the James Gang rode the range, the man-made Lake of the Ozarks remains the only deep-water lake in Missouri. It rests several counties away from the production's home base in sleepy Pineville, Missouri, where a starstruck city council let his crew bury Main Street in fill dirt and nail wooden facades over the storefronts downtown. Justice of the Peace, Acme Tool Company, First National Bank of Northfield. Due to these and other on-location expenses, Henry King's budget for Jesse James is already over $1 million and climbing each second this goddamn horse doesn't jump off that goddamn cliff.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. So what I was thinking about when I made that last comment was I love thinking about perhaps what Henry King is thinking, because you have this line later in the story about why he sits alone drinking at night, because he's worried that he's not going to be part of history, that directors like John Ford and Alfred Hitchcock, he already knows they're doing more impressive things, more interesting things than he's doing. And I love I love thinking about how, like, those old Hollywood movies, right? It was like, we're going to do it like this, and everything's like basically planned out. So
Yeah.
like when Henry King does the shot reverse shot like over and over and over, and it's just like, we get that it's a conversation, but like
Yeah.
but
Mix
like
it
what,
up, man.
yeah, what's the interesting part here though,
Take a risk.
yeah, exactly.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I was fascinated by Henry King as a way into this because he was sort of an also ran among the great directors of this era, right? Who were out there creating these incredible masterpieces that are still hailed as such. And he's here making these, kind of B tier, westerns to appease the studio. And I just sort of I extrapolated a bit there because there's not much out there about Henry King. I mean, there's really not. There was some stuff about the production, like everything I just read about Pineville and about the Lake of the Ozarks, which is hilarious to me, by the way, because I live in St. Louis. I'm not a Missouri native. I'm from Pennsylvania. And the Lake of the Ozarks is like the redneck Riviera out here. Like, it's Missouri, like Missouri people will speak of it fondly in that way. Like, it's just a whole bunch of drunk people on boats and fireworks and and so the fact that this took place there because at the time it was this idyllic, serene, natural place, was just the cognitive dissonance in that was really delicious to me. So I enjoyed learning that about it as well, and realizing that this really was a Missouri story too. But King, I sort of extrapolate, like, how would an artist feel in that sort of position? Because there must be some artistic impulse in somebody who decides to become a director,
Yeah,
right?
there has to
Yeah,
be.
there has to be. And yeah, and I could just see him, budgets were really tight back then, especially on location things like this with, I mean, they had Tyrone Power. He wasn't a huge draw. Um, they were, they were kind of they were already over budget, right?
Yeah,
So I sort of just extrapolated from that how King might be feeling about this horse not performing as it was expected to, even though they're asking it to perform in a way that goes against every instinct a living being has.
yeah. Well, and maybe to just skip ahead in my
Mm.
questions, like maybe you can just talk about what happened um, to get those two shots we looked at earlier, because that horse did not jump off that cliff of its own accord.
No, you can tell. You can tell when you watch it. Well, what happened, near as I could piece together, okay? Because that's the other reason why I call my stories fiction is, oftentimes I'm working with different eyewitness accounts, and people, it's all very Rashomon, people people don't remember things the same way. But near as I can tell, they decided to use something called a tilt chute to dump the horse and rider off of the cliff. Because in the sequence, Jesse is and his brother are supposed to be riding the horses over the cliff in like a majestic sort of moment.
Right.
But they ended up a tilt chute is used typically with like goats and sheep and things like that to like dump them into a flea bath or something. So certainly not from a height like that. But you can tell that was the other thing too, is like I'm so struck when I watch footage of horses, um, as a horse person. And that was a thing that I really was conscious of doing throughout the whole collection. Was okay, what do I see that someone who isn't a horse person might not see? And how can I articulate that to them in a way that's instructive, in a way that helps them see it a different way, but also, is dramatically interesting. So, yeah, but they really it's horrifying once you really visualize what they did.
Also, Cliff Lyons is like, yeah, I'll jump off this 70-foot cliff, like to keep basically to keep my job.
Mhm.
And so I'm thinking like, culture is really interested in spectacle,
Yes.
um, regardless of the danger. Um,
Mhm.
and so I was interested in what you thought the difference is between literature and image.
Mm.
And how do you think the overabundance of images available now has affected fiction and the imagination?
Yeah. This is actually something I'm really fascinated by. There's this great book, Dickens. It's like Dickens and the Dawn of the Cinema. And yeah, it's a crazy book. And it's basically proposes the concept of proto-cinematic literature, and that literature kind of anticipated the invention of film through the train and other technologies that were sort of speeding up how people were visually absorbing the world around them. So like in the fiction of like William Dean Howells, for instance, you'll see these sequences where it seems like he's being cinematic, but he's writing in like 1893. He couldn't be, that happens around the turn of the century. I did part of my dissertation on this. That
Okay.
happens around the turn of the century. And then throughout the 20th century, with the advent of modernism and then the sort of embracing of the jump cut in fiction, right? You get to a point where cinematic language and uh, fiction language become almost synonymous, and that's fascinating to me. And so I'm really always interested in the ways that you can play with image on the page that you can't play with the image when it's just the image. You can comment on it, you can draw the viewer's attention to different parts of it. You can treat it almost like you're giving a lecture on it, as if it's a painting, and get them to and point out what you want them to see. And that's something that, when I've read other authors that do that, I've just been, ooh, I want to do that.
Yeah.
So I think that's true for a lot of people, though. It's like you see a writer doing something that you think is cool, and you're like, huh, I wonder what I can borrow from that in terms of form or thinking about things like image differently.
Yeah. Uh, since I was just in a museum not too long ago,
I love museums.
I
Which
have,
one?
oh, good Lord. It was in Cambridge, England. Um,
Oh,
and yeah, that's why I can't remember right off the top of my head what it was.
sure. Whirlwind of travel, I'm sure.
Yes. Anyway, so I'm in there, and almost exclusively the paintings are pretty much uh, discernible. You can tell what the painting is about.
Yes.
You could say, this is the content of the painting.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was looking at this other painting that was very definitely abstract art.
Mm.
And this elderly lady happened to be there at the same time I was there, and she says, "quote That's what you see when you need your cataracts doing."
I love her.
And so I had a conversation with this lady about the piece, and it was just like it was so amazing. And I told my friend like afterwards, I was like, maybe I want cataracts. Like if cataracts look like that
Bring
it's
it, bring
amazing.
it on.
Bring it
Right.
on.
No, that's wow. I love her so much.
Yeah.
What a wit in the classic British.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, you look at paintings, from Renaissance or Baroque, right? And it's so easy to tell what they are. And then you have the romantic turn, and it becomes more about what do you think is happening here? And then you get abstraction, right? Which, yeah, I have probably an art history minor that I'm a couple credits shy of.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I'm fascinated by the way that people see things. And so that's something that I hope is evident in each of my stories, is that I'm not just straightforwardly recounting things. I'm directing you, you know, directing you to see this event in a certain way, or to consider this image in a new way. And see, and that sounds like that's what that museum patron did for you.
Yeah.
It's sort of, yeah. And that's what I think is just so fascinating about images, and why I think I'm drawn to them in my work. I'll weave in photographs occasionally, as you saw in the collection, and use photographs as jumping off points, because I think so often, particularly with the older stuff that I look at, like stuff from the 19th century, it's like, well, you get one line about what's happening here.
Right.
Do your best. But now with the internet, haha, I get so much more than one line, don't I?
Oh yes.
um yeah, because I have that Xennial superpower of good research skills. We were all taught how to search like crazy people.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So earlier you were mentioning how you like digging through the archives. And,
Mm.
I kind of, one of the things I loved about your writing is your use of adjectives. Like in the excerpt that you read, uh, the ones that came to mind to me were serene, sublime, and rangy. I thought
Hmm.
brilliant. And
Thanks.
so my question is, what's the secret to finding the right adjective, and how do you not overuse adjectives?
Ooh, ooh. Mm.
Yeah,
For me, so much about how a sentence is constructed comes down to rhythm and feel.
yeah,
So, oftentimes, assonance will play a role in how I'm choosing an adjective. Um, Also, I'm a very firm believer that there's no such thing as a true synonym. The connotations of are so different, and the feeling of the word, the tone of the word is different. So, oftentimes, rangy is a good it's a Western it's a
yeah.
Western sounding word, Western. Sublime, I'm thinking of it in the Burkean sense, I mean, and maybe my reader's not, but I'm thinking of it in like, that sense of awe. Um, and serene, I've just always loved that word. It's just it sounds like what it is. There's an onomatopoeic quality to it. Um, so I think that influences a lot of my choices. In terms of doing not doing too many, again, it's like this weird sort of feel thing. Like I always tell my students that writing is an additive art and that it's different from having a brick of marble and then chipping away at it. You have to build the brick of marble first
Yeah.
and then chip away at it. And so a lot of writing happens in the chipping away for me. And I think that's true for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Maybe some people love it, some people hate it. I love it. But often like just kind of refining the sentence and the sentences around the sentence until the rhythm feels correct,
Mhm.
if that's making sense.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, uh, I often I do the the thing where you're like, this is not the right word, but I need something similar. So I'll look up like synonyms and I'll be like,
Mm,
hmm.
mm,
Mm. But then you look up like you find a different word later and you're like, this is closer,
right.
but you kind of keep like moving around until you're like, oh, that's it. You find it, you
Mm,
hit it. Um, but even in the synonyms, right? Like the words are short or long. There's all kinds of differences. The letters are different,
the
and
syllabics, yeah, it's
which
like
means the sounds are different. Yeah,
mhm, mhm, and then how's it gonna play with the words that are before and after it? Like, this is and I love fiction where the writer has clearly taken those pains
yeah.
at the sentence level, because that's what I love to do, and I think you can see that throughout the collection. I really care about precision of language, and I also really care about concision of language. I try not to gild the lily unless it's narratively necessary. I got in a fight with an editor once about the mammoth horse because the story is told from the point of view of a carnival barker, like a washed up sort of carnival man, a raconteur, and he uses a lot of adverbs. He's over the top. That's the voice. And an editor wanted me to cut all the adverbs. And I was like, this is one story where, I know that you think I didn't do this intentionally, but trust me, you know? And I won in the end, but it was just an odd conversation. Because normally I would agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, yeah, and I also was thinking about when I was reading, like particularly that story. I was like,
Mm,
what era was this written in? you know,
Mm.
and like in a good way, right? In a good way, where it's like, it doesn't feel like it came out this year.
For the century,
Yeah,
maybe. Yeah.
or this century. Yeah,
Well, I love Poe.
yeah,
I love Poe. I've always been a big fan of the sort of romantic Poe Coleridge tradition of "Let me grab you by the lapel and tell you my tale." So that was kind of the frame I chose for that story. Just kind of looking up who the players were at the time and who would have been around and what would have gone down. Other than the horse, of course. But yeah, the kind of just searching around that I think is really fascinating to me.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
So let's finish where we started, shall we?
Mm.
We're going back to the horse,
Ah,
and I was just thinking about how the horse is such a big symbol in America,
oh yeah.
particularly the West or the countryside. Um, and even now, things like cars are measured in horsepower. We play the basketball game called horse. We use explicit language involving the horse, like horse shit and horse's ass. Um, you know, but horses generally, I think, maybe represent wildness or beauty.
Hmm.
And yet they're repeatedly seen in some form of captivity, such
Hmm.
as reins, saddles, hauling something stabled, penned, personified, etc. So, what do you think caused this divide, and what
Mm.
does it say about the cultural zeitgeist?
Interesting. Interesting. Hmm. Well, uh, I read a lot about while I was doing this collection, I read a lot about sort of the passing of the horse, which is what it's called, in terms of the sweep of American culture and this sort of move from being ubiquitous in almost every industry, right, to total obsolescence, right, and now being seen as the province of the wealthy, which at least out here in the Midwest is not true.
Right.
Um,
Definitely not.
uh, in other parts of the country, the East Coast, oh yeah,
Yeah.
West Coast, but yeah, out here. But yeah, it's this sense that the horse is multiple things in the fabric of American culture, and that some of those things are paradoxical. As you said, it's like they represent freedom, but they're always shown being restrained. I think a lot of it has to do with how humans view ourselves, as those who have dominion, or I mean, I don't view it that way, but I think a lot of people do subconsciously or otherwise. And so, there's this sense that they represent this freedom, this wildness, but also that they need to be controlled or contained or dominated or used. The farm that I grew up riding at was actually called the Use and Hoss Ranch. I mean, kind of facetiously,
Yeah.
because the idea was that they weren't going to have any horses on property that they weren't using.
Yeah.
Um, which, pragmatically from a financial perspective makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I think that one of the stories in the book, based on a true story, which takes us to the world of The Boy in the Plastic Bubble, starring John Travolta. There's a horse in that movie. I have the line in there, the horse is a metaphor.
Hmm.
And I think that's true for the whole collection. The horse is a metaphor. It's something that it's one of those animals that humankind has kind of grown up with in the same way as the dog or the cat.
Yeah.
Like, that's really the holy trinity in terms of companion animals and impacts on, and in terms of impact on society, the horse has them all beat in terms of just sheer, you know, ability to assist us in building the modern world. And I think a lot of people forget that, and that was something that I wanted the book to sort of acknowledge, is that the horse is so often a metaphor, but it's also something real, someone real, in a lot of these cases, because I've known horses very, very deeply, in the same way that I think a lot of my friends have known like their dogs and cats. And Yeah, it's a partnership that I'm kind of sad that it's rare these days, but that's just how our society evolved.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, these are all things I think about a lot, and I think you can. I hope it shows through in the book. I
Yeah.
think about them a lot.
Well, one thing that I just thought of that I don't think I've ever thought of before
Mm.
is humans ride horses, cats ride humans. And I mean,
It's
that's
so
what it
true.
is.
It's so true, you know? Yeah, and it's just I'm fascinated by, the relationships that we have with animals. That's something that I think is always a theme in what I do. It's certainly a theme in the stories I'm writing now, as well, kind of branching out into other animals, other partnerships, or, relationships gone awry. Because that I just think it's so fascinating. It's such fascinating territory, particularly, now, as we see animals more and more being kind of displaced or morphed into the spaces that humans want them to be in. So something that I think is interesting.
Well, that's a good place to end on an interesting note. So, Jess, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank
Uh,
you.
you should go check out Horse Show, out now on Santa Fe Writers Project.
Mhm.
And your website is jessbowers.org.
It is. It is. You can keep up with everything I'm doing there. And the book is anywhere you want to buy books. Your local should be able to get it. Bookshop.org. Uh, Also the evil corporations, but wherever you want to get it is cool.
All right. Thank you so much, Jess.
All right. Thanks.